the order. From of course, the task of implementation will have next time. We're looking that we will have elected government change of the democratic system, transition from an autocracy to democracy, a transition. At the same time, we are hoping there will be also a transition for the economy, moving from a long period of stasis in reforms to a period of some radical and significant reforms that will change the shape of the economy as well. And the economy is in a very critical juncture. And the situation is something like what we had in 1991. The change of government from autocracy to democracy. And there was this transition from a inward-looking, highly controlled economy to an outward-looking, more open, market-oriented economy. So this current situation seems to represent that 1991 moment. We can call this 1991 moment because this is something similar to what happened in those years, 1990 and 1991. And we are all looking forward to whether we are ready to do the kind of changes that happened in 1991 for the politics as well as for the economy. So presently the economy has been facing several shocks. So we look at the economy and say, oh, this is growth is slowed down, 4% growth. Everybody would think that this is roughly what we are left with. But I want to tell you that this is not the intrinsic growth rate for Bangladesh economy. Bangladesh economy in normal times, and hopefully once the elections are over, we will have a judge around the city. And then the intrinsic growth rate of Bangladesh is 5.5% to 6% if you go to the reforms. And if you do some of the radical fundamental reforms that have become necessary, then the economy is much faster, much faster. 7-8% growth is something. But when we face from external developments that will be moving this economy, unless we respond very substantially, tinkering at the margin, business as usual, and muddling through is no longer the option. We have to do some fundamental changes. We have 3 or 4 developments that we need to take before we talk about it. Number 1, this is good news. EPA, Economic Partnership with Japan, Bangladesh, Japan, India. This is a historical moment. It's a monumental achievement. And we have to give credit to the interim government. Was key representative of the interim government. This couldn't have happened in so short a time. The kind of commitment and dedicated work that the team did in the past year and a half. So this is a game changer. And you could read all the facilities that have been provided. It's an asymmetrical reciprocity. It's a case of asymmetrical reciprocity in the sense that Bangladesh has been given, or Bangladesh is offered much lower openness compared to what Japan has. And it's a good gesture from a developed country which has been a friend of Bangladesh for the last 54 years. And this particular agreement tells us that they will. And I would think an FTA would have been a much better outcome if it had been done, unfortunately, because of Bangladesh's current condition, and particularly the complexity of our tariff situation that makes any FTA literally impossible. So here was Japan, but Japanese government very interested in the FTA. Which couldn't be done. So we have half left, but this is still a major achievement. Then comes a shock we have to acknowledge and respond, take action, which is the launch of the India-EU free trade. This FTA, which we did not anticipate, this FTA would be negotiated for the past 20 years, and one would have concluded that this is not going to happen. But sadly, the geopolitical developments made it essential that India reach agreement with the EU, and it was mutually advantageous to reach the agreement without delay. And this, as you can see, the provisions are India now gets particularly what is relevant for us. Our main export when we go into the EU, in which we have a share of 48%. That, and we also had this zero tariff access to the EU market. That is going to be stressful because of serious competition from and from the very start, we are getting this zero tariff access for ready-made garments. And the Indian government has focused on production-linked incentives domestically. For the textile sector, garment sector, we have done a lot of things on this. So we are behind on that kind of. So it's not just a free trade agreement that is going to be problematic, but all the plans and programs that the neighboring is done, and we are behind on that. So we have to immediately respond. We have to immediately start working on it. Otherwise, LDC graduation or not, unless we have some almost equal agreement or similar agreements with the EU in a short time, maybe 2 or 3 years. That's all we have. We can't wait longer than that. But I have to tell you, our house is not enough. We can't have an FTA. The EU is the second largest market in the world, after the United States. But we had a tariff, mountain-sized tariffs and complex tariff, which do not make it easy to do anything. So we have to, this is the time that we have to really get down to business. If we don't do it, we don't get our house in order, we will not be able to do it. So, new government comes, new government will have to look at this particular institution we call national board, where all the bottlenecks, the problems now. This is where we have to take action in order to work with the world market. On the Shomosha, a world market, Shomosha, when it childhood development, so access on the game, it doesn't help unless we set our house up. And we can't have the Shomosha rate. So we have to first rationalize our tariff structure. We have to set our trade regime in order. A trade regime we can't make the kind of progress that we will see around. We have no choice. The world is changing. The world is changing and we have to respond to those changes. If we don't, we will be moving back. Our recently, which is the India-US trade. Interim trade, FTA, India, EU, FTA, mother of all deals, mother of all trade agreements. What I would say, father of all trade agreements. India, US trade deal, it's an interim trade. Interim in the sense that they still have to start reducing their imports of oil from Russia. So I'm going to go from tonight. Hopefully, by tomorrow, we will know what trade deal we are getting from the United States. Hopefully, it will at least match, if not better, than what India has. So, these are external developments that Bangladesh will have to take from, without which our economy would be difficult. So, we hope that the next one takes place. To come back to the current situation, understanding ASEAN, we have our keynote presenter, Ashikur Rahman, that's the keynote presentation. And I try to reflect on the external complement each other with that. So I need to be part of it. But I have missed something very important. First, thank and welcome Chief Guest, Dr. Salehuddin Ahmed, the Honourable Adviser in the Ministry of Finance, for raising this occasion as Chief Guest. And then I will need to introduce Dr. Salehuddin, but I'm also very grateful that Dr. K.A.S. Murshid, who was the former Director General of the K.A.S, a leading economist of the country, who was heading the task force on strategic economic reforms. Okay. So you can see his 7-page report that has come out, then published already. And then I have to also welcome good friend Dr. Famina Khatun, the Executive Directors, as distinguished panelists. And also on the right side is our good friend from the Australian High Commission, Mr. Clinton. He's a guest of honor today. And as always, a guest of honor at PRI. This kind. So welcome to Dr. Famina. Then how can I miss Dr. Masroor Riaz, the chairman of Policy Exchange, the new kid in town, let me say, but very dynamic kid in town. It's all see him commenting on everything that's good. And then we have very distinguished people all around. So without naming names, I can see all very, very distinguished faces. So thank you so much for coming and having patience to come. So let me proceed to some elements of economic reforms that we have been associating. So, thanks to our chief guest who put me in charge of this particular exercise. Dealt you with the tax policy. All of us know that the NPR, the National as I said, it's an institution that is really lobbying economic progress. Anyways, there's a lot of resistance. So the idea of having policy making and implementation in the same place doesn't make sense. Everybody knows. Everybody this who understands tax policy and economic policy also understands that you can't have policy and implementation say the fundamental problems. So accordingly, after 20 years of pushing this agenda, the interim government did make progress on bifurcating this particular institution to what is called a revenue policy division and revenue management division. A bifurcation, unfortunately, by the end of the period of the actual work of this bifurcated institution did not start for certain administrative issues, but it is hope that the new government does take this seriously and moves the reforms necessary, which means implementing institutional aggregation schemes. What we did in our exercises for tax policy reforms agenda that is to be taken forward, we found current tax systems will have the following deficiencies. The tax base is very high. It's not the tax rates that the important part is that we have a narrow tax base. The tax administration is overly manual. They haven't been digitizing, they haven't been moving forward with automation. Yeah, as I do that, this package from UNTAD, which was launched in 1994 for the customs administration, that is supposed to be an automated system of customs. And till today, customs automation is not taken. Bits and starts quite episodic, but that hasn't been done. For which we have paid $1.6 million recently for the use of that package, and we paid $110,000 every year. Only barely 20-25% of the package is actually being used. So 75% remains unused, and they have kinds of fines on their table, which should have disappeared by now. 30 plus years have taken place, and Ashikur should have been used for many more things than just clearance of goods and producing data. So economic is a big step required here. So that's another thing. The other point is Bangladesh tax system is heavily reliant not only on trade tax, but heavily reliant on indirect taxes rather than direct. So the ratio between indirect and direct tax is just 70% to 30%. That means indirect taxes are more aggressive. So that's another problem. Regressivity. The proposal is to move towards more progressivity that we direct tax will break. This is the direct taxes in the US. So the proposal of the tax reform, policy reform task force was to move towards 50-50. Indirect tax 50%. Trade tax you can have 28% of tax revenue comes from trade tax. This is too heavy a reliance on trade tax. Again, Bangladesh is way ahead of other peers in collecting revenue. It's very distorted. It can change with the right now, roughly 2.5% of GDP is collected from trade taxes. It should be down to 100% of GDP. That should be targeted in 10 years by 2020. That should be down to the large trade taxes reduced. Priority on the trade policy side, on the trade taxes side, some priority issues that we have highlighted are worth noting, and hopefully for the next government take action. Besides reducing the reliance on trade taxes, what we need is modernization and rationalization of the tariff. This is a big item that is preventing Bangladesh from reaching FTAs. Bangladesh in 25 countries, 26 countries which have the FTA negotiation. The actor of Hamina, it will not. First barrier to the FTA is our current tariff situation. So if an able to action now, we will not get any FTA. Right now, getting an FTA with the EU is going to be a top priority. Otherwise, we are going to be losing our big time. Another fundamental, problem related to আমাদের challenge বলছি export diversification. এটা হচ্ছে না, the big thing is anti-export bias of the trade regime. Trade, এখানে tariff and protection regime যেটা বর্তমানে আছে, this is creating a negative impact on export incentive. যতই আমরা export subsidy দিই না কেন, export subsidy 10% আছে, আগে 15% 20% ছিল, মানে 10% আমি এক্সপোর্ট দিচ্ছি, আবার ওই এক্সপোর্ট প্রোডাক্টটা মানে রেডিমেড গার্মেন্টস হয়, ওটা যদি দেশের বাজারে বিক্রি করে, they are getting protection of 80%. So you get 10% subsidy if you export them. If you sell in the domestic market, you're getting a tariff protection of 86%. So the price, what you get from exports is so much less than what you get in the domestic market. That discourages exports. The problem that this needs to be solved by the next big time. That's it. Industrial protection. Protection. But we cannot have protection ad infinitum. We cannot have protection for 50 and 60 years. There is no logic for that. So you have to bring protection down. It has to be time bound. It has to be performance based. Any idea that into the next government or any new government the Bangladesh consumers are paying for this protection. Protection is a tax on them. And these consumers have been, but they have no voice. Most of the negotiations are being done by the business sectors. NBR has these negotiation, pre-budget negotiation, pre-budget discussions with the producers rather than. So this is classic situation. You can have protection, but how high should protection be? And how long should you consider? So that is something that needs to be done. This is a supplementary duty situation. It's a classic case of complete regression of the tax system. Using supplementary duty for protection purpose. Even that is not just have this value added tax. 1400 tariff lines that we can import it with that as a domestic land. You can't have this once you regulate out. It's non-compliant, which is not compliant, and we are still committed to a good space. So immediately the reform to exist, and we are hoping that the new government can overhaul the tax institution. Without this overhaul, I'm pretending project to be too volatile. So we are hoping that we will have some very hard system started in 1991, and we had under the democratic government can do much of economic reform. They are much better place, and they have the power to get reforms. This is our experience. Hopefully it's good. In future. I go to keynote speaker, principal economist of PRI, Ashikur Rahman, for making the keynote.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Honourable Chief Guest. Thank you, participants, friends from the media, friends from the development community, and friends from the think tank community. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. I will, as a first down batsman, I will not repeat what Dr. Zaidi has said. So, but bottom line is that BD has navigated, Bangladesh has navigated rough waters for 18 months, and we have had a real challenge to stabilize the economy and recraft the growth momentum. Now, on the stabilization bit, we had some success, but in terms of reigniting the growth momentum, the scenario is precarious. And that is what we need to now figure out. I think that is the elected government now needs to figure out that how you can maintain stabilization and reignite the growth momentum in an international context where shocks and uncertainty is the new normal. We are navigating an international arena where ruptures are happening, the rule-based order is under threat, and the efficiency doctrine is being challenged by the security doctrine. So these are the contexts within which we need to recraft our economic road and strategy forward. So I will not repeat the external sector achievements. I think Bangladesh has, sorry, I think the point is not working. I have some IT help here. So in terms of, in the financial sector, I think we have really two big challenges. I think there's no way to avoid those challenges. The first challenge is in the financial sector, and there's a real challenge in the fiscal sector. And if you think about it, within the financial sector, when the interim government took charge, they inherited battle on two fronts. There was a roaring inflation problem, and then there was a banking sector problem. And when you have these two challenges at the same time, stabilization becomes very difficult. Now, to improve the inflation agenda, to address the inflation agenda, we know that the interim government has adopted a contractionary monetary policy stance. And if you see the trend over the last 12 months, yes, there has been a modest improvement. Inflation did come down from 12%, around 12%, to around 8.5%. Of course, there was a lot of instability and a lot of law and order issue. It was not business as usual. Monetary policy transmission was not exercised in a normal scenario. So the bite on inflation was not as strong as one would have expected. On the banking sector, we know that our banking sector was plundered with impunity. Almost $20 to $25 billion left the banking sector, right? And to do that, I think the first challenge that the interim government faced was to stop bank runs. And to get that credibility, and I think they did that job very well. Bangladesh did not have a bank run. Banks did not collapse, and confidence was restored. And two important things that happened on that arena was that the plunderers were removed, a resolution regime was installed, and the size of the real problem was discovered through AQR. Now, if you look at this slide, you can see that NPL within the private sector banks was reported to be like 7% in 2024, and all of a sudden it's 32% now. So the NPL did not increase, the NPL was just hidden. And the AQRs revealed the real NPL, and now we know the size of the problem, and that is one thing that we have to address. So in terms of the financial sector, I think real progress happened in terms of identifying the size of the problem, restoring, the confidence in the market. You can see the deposit growth fell to almost 7%. In the beginning of the interim government. Now it has improved to 12% nearly, which shows that the confidence that was not there in the banking sector is coming back. But the credit growth dimension did not improve, and we know because investors, and we have the business community here, are holding back for an elected government to come in. And I think that kind of did not trigger the kind of credit growth U-turn that we wanted to achieve. So, in terms of financial sector reform, the elected government has a lot in their plate. I think the first We have narrowed 5 key areas that the elected government must commit to in terms of financial sector reform. First, they need to think about this huge $6.4 trillion taka NPL in the banking sector's balance sheet. That needs to be mitigated. Now, the global strategy is to get an asset management company. There are many good examples from Malaysia and China that can be used. And I think that is number one agenda, that's a very key agenda that the elected government must give commitment to. The second thing that needs attention is that we do now have a resolution regime ordinance, but to create that regime, you need a lot of measures. And the elected government needs to ensure that the resolution regime is put in place skillfully to navigate potential bank failures. And there's a lot of things that you can do to improve how resolution regime efficacy in the sector. There also needs to be a decision by the elected government on the role of FID and whether there needs to be 2 regulators in the banking sector or 1. And we have seen and we have suffered banks going rogue, bank boards going rogue, which is why we have seen $20 billion siphoned off from the banking sector, which is why Banking Companies Act needs real attention by the elected government so that governance is established within the banking boards of the private sector and the state-owned sector. Lastly, the central bank independence agenda. I think it is now, the ball is in the court of the elected government. I think independence with accountability to the parliament is important to prevent future economic oligarchs from plundering the banking sector and ensuring that there is real credibility to ensure that the banking sector and the financial sector can move forward. There are other areas too that we need to attend. We cannot have a financial sector where short-term deposits finance long-term loans. We need to pay attention to the capital market and the corporate bond market where no visible improvement has happened. If I give an example, India's corporate bond market is $600 billion. And Bangladesh's capital corporate bond market is $500 million. To put that in context, you cannot support long-term financing just by depending on short-term bank deposits. So this is an area I feel that the elected government needs to offer. In terms of the fiscal outlook, I think the story is partially touched by Dr. Sattar. Our tax GDP ratio is an Achilles heel. We don't have the space, and that space further shrink in fiscal year 2024 and 2025. Some improvements have happened over the last 6 months. Our revenue growth is at around 15%, but still, it has amplified bank borrowing, it has amplified debt servicing, it has amplified the interest rate export burden on our fiscal space. Now, this, of course, has compressed our spending in social sector, our spending in the annual development program, which has also been a reason why growth has kind of contracted to 4% in the current fiscal year. So in the fiscal sector, we believe we need to support strong leadership in NBR. We need to protect revenue carriers. We need to move away from the indirect taxes regime and achieve at least a 50-50 split by 2030 between direct and indirect taxes. And we need to tap on ideas like property taxes and go towards a kind of single VAT rate. Last but not least, we need to pay attention to our SOE sector. It is becoming a very heavy sector on our fiscal space. Its fiscal contingent liabilities around 11% of GDP. And if you offload NPLs to our state asset management company, it's expected to go further. And lastly, the subsidy framework needs strong attention from the next elected government. Now, I'm going to finish off with certain insights from the political economy of reform. Now, there is an argument, and I'm respectful towards that argument that reform is a continuous process. And there might be some truth to that. But the political economy literature of reform says that reform should be front-loaded. And because the benefits of the reform come later and the costs are incurred in the earlier stages. Therefore, if you don't use the first 2 years of an elected government for pushing bold reform, then the reform momentum is likely to fade. So the rule book is act early, B, create coalition, and compensate the losers. Now, this is a playbook for the next elected government. We must show bold commitment to economic reform, not from day 2, not from day 3, not from day 4, but day 1. Because status quo is not sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ashik. Very well presented, very comprehensive outlook for economic reforms. And you're very correct. We need bold reforms with commitment, and from day 1. There is no option but to really go for substantial reform. There is no option for business as usual or muddling through. We need to stop muddling through to real serious reforms, because around us, the world is changing fast. The world is not going to be very friendly. It's a tough world, it's a competitive world, and we have to show that we can be competitive. There's a lot to do. The agenda is packed up. Now I think there was a request from our guest of honor, Mr. Benson of the Australian High Commission, who has been very kind to support PRI work in this particular area, and particularly economic reform agenda. So go ahead, George.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to acknowledge our Chief Guest, Dr. Salehuddin Ahmed, the Honourable Adviser to the Ministry of Finance, Dr. Zaidi, Sattar, Chairman of the PRI, Dr. Ashikur Rahman, Principal Economist of PRI, and all the distinguished panelists and all participants, as mentioned. My name is Pobke. I'm the Deputy High Commissioner of the Australian High Commission here in Bangladesh. My thanks to the tolerance of my panelists for letting me jump early on the program. I really wanted to say very few words and then very much get out of the way of the discussion. I should say it's wonderful to see so many people here tonight for this discussion. As an economist, I've thoroughly enjoyed attending PRI events over the last 12 months. PRI's work generating data and analysis to inform policymakers and the public is critical. Likewise, events like this create a town square for debate and contestability to understand the insights and the interests of a broad range of society. So I've enjoyed going on the journey with PRI, especially on the eve of this very historic election. It looks like their work has culminated into something very significant. I would also like to recognise the rich ecosystem of economic thinkers in Bangladesh, in governments, in think tanks, in academia, in private sector, and industry groups. Many are here in the room with us tonight. You are all a true asset for the country. As a foreign diplomat, it's not for me to weigh in directly on the challenges or the policy solutions, especially when I'm sitting in a room surrounded by people infinitely more qualified to do so. But I did want to reflect on two things tonight. First, the underlying economic potential here in Bangladesh. And secondly, to recognise that as we are at something of a historic crossroads, this brings unique considerations to policymakers. So, look, yes, mirroring the remarks of Dr. Sattar, my personal view with Bangladesh's growth potential is tremendous. If you look at some of the foundational democratic works on development and growth, such as in the Washington Consensus or Commission on Growth and Development, you'll find lots of those policy pieces haven't been especially strong historically in Bangladesh. And yet, since independence, it's still consistently pushing out 5% growth, 6% growth every year, even despite periods of moments of upheaval. So, if a future government can get a few more of those foundational pieces in place, there is no reason Bangladesh couldn't sustain 8, 9, 10% growth and take its place as an economic powerhouse. And I think in a number of areas, important steps have taken place in Bangladesh over the last 18 months. I'm thinking of things like reforms to the exchange rate policy, prudential regulation of the banking sector, including the bank resolution regime, measures to buttress the independence of the central bank, efforts to reform the energy sector, efforts to improve tax administration and governance, and even reforms in the judicial sector can have important economic dividends, such as the recent establishment of commercial courts. But if we want to get to that 8, 9, 10% economic growth world, then these need to be seen as the first steps, not the final steps. So, the first question that faces an elected government is the extent to which it can lock in the reform gains. And in the cases where reforms have been instituted by ordinance, there will be a very challenging time crunch, in addition to this set out by Dr. Chi. Many reforms will expire if not brought to Parliament and signed into law. Of course, I want to be very clear that it will be the democratic prerogative of an elected government what it does do and what it doesn't do, and what form that takes. But that said, it's my hope that economic reform momentum does not stall, but rather economic reform momentum continues to build in Bangladesh in order to deliver on Bangladesh's undeniable economic potential. So for our part, Australia will be here to assist in this journey where it is desired by the people of Bangladesh and the government of Bangladesh. Our support through the World Bank is aimed at responding to the economic reform priorities of the Bangladesh government. Our support through the International Finance Corporation will help drive private sector development. And we will continue to support the think tank ecosystem to foster public debates and events like this one. And finally, through our enhanced Austrade presence, this is the organisation Trade and Investment Commission. We will continue to drive two-way trade and accelerate our rapidly growing partnership. So I wish all participants here the very best. Again, I offer my thanks for having me here tonight and really look forward to the discussion tonight. And above all, I wish Bangladesh the very best in the next step of its democratic journey and of its economic development journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it's great to good to know that our friends in Australia are filling that commission. Just as after the statements from the shop. And just to recall, you think Bangladesh can grow at a much faster rate. Things like 8%. We had almost forgotten. We're now growing at 4% or less. But let me tell you, between 2001 and 2010, first 10 years of the 21st century, average GDP growth was 6%. And that was at a time when the country was suffering from huge power shortages. We said power shortages were really binding constraints. Yet the economy was growing at an average of 6%. Nobody questioned those growth rates. Nobody said that the DBS was overestimated. So I want to say that the intrinsic growth rate of the Bangladesh economy is at 5.5%. But if we do these radical reforms that are piled up over the years, the economy can grow at 7, 8, 9%. And more. So the economy is poised to do that. Why don't we do the reform? Because the external developments are such that if you don't do these everything for that. Thank you. Thank you, sir. May I now invite Dr. Thakur, Executive Director, very high profile Executive Director of the Center for Policy.
Thank you for really, I won't say they're big, but this is too much. You have been very kind. So, Honourable Chief Guest, Dr. Salehuddin Ahmed, Honourable Adviser to the Minister of Finance, distinguished managers here, and yes, I would like to thank Dr. Ashikur for this excellent presentation, and of course, the introductory presentation. I think everything has been said, so I was asking Ashikur what to add to that. So let me just, permission, I will take the language. I'll switch to Bangla for convenience. Let me start with the table, the presentation in front of you have. এখানে একটা টেবিল আছে স্ন্যাপশট অফ বাংলাদেশের কারেন্ট স্টেট তো আমি যদি ডক্টর আশিকের লাস্ট conclusion দিয়ে শুরু করি তো we really emphasized on a very important issue which is the crux of the issue যেটা হচ্ছে যে political economy angle. So political economy টা যদি আমরা ঠিক না করতে পারি তাহলে কিন্তু রিফর্ম হবে না, সেটাই উনি খুব গুরুত্ব দিয়ে বলেছেন। এবং এই টেবিলটাতে আপনারা যদি দেখেন যে ম্যাক্সিমাম ইকোনমিক ইন্ডিকেটর 2022 তে যেগুলো ছিল তারপর থেকে কিন্তু ডেসিমারেশন হয়েছে বিফোর দিস ইন্টারিম রেজিম হ্যাড কাম। সো আমরা তো এক সময়ে খুব ভালো ইকোনমিক গ্রোথ এবং অনেক সূচকে ভালো ছিলাম, লো ইনফ্লেশন রেট ছিল, and remittance, export income, economic সবই ভালো ছিল। But COVID 2020 এবং followed by Ukraine war, সেটার পরে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে গ্লোবালি ইকোনমিক শক যেটা সেটা বাংলাদেশে হয়েছে because of supply chain disruption, production, logistical disruption, and all of this. So, but during that period, we also observe যে আমাদের ইকোনমিক ফান্ডামেন্টালস গুলা কতখানি vulnerable কোভিড ইস্যু particularly একের পর এক particularly মনে করেন যে স্বাস্থ্য খাত হেলথ সেক্টরে যে অনেক ধরনের বড় বড় দুর্নীতিগুলা রিপিট হতে থাকে যে because despite our various infrastructure in the health sector, অনেক corruption, lack of governance সেগুলো বিমোচিত থাকে। তারপরে এই যে ডিসেলারেশন সমুদ্রে থাকে then বাংলাদেশ কিন্তু আর সেখান থেকে ঘুরে দাঁড়াতে পারছিল না। For a long period of time আমাদের বাংলাদেশের এই ইকোনমিক গ্রোথ মোমেন্টাম থাকার ফলে পভার্টি রিডাকশন হয়েছে, ইনইকুয়ালিটি যদিও বাড়ছিল কিন্তু poverty reduction and a lot of people had could come out of the poverty and also per capita income বাড়ছিল। So and Bangladesh's economic development, social development became something to be shown, to be displayed in front of the global community. Bangladesh's success story, developing miracle despite governance. So all these stories. But then after this, there has been momentum for higher global shock, but inherent weaknesses. Current growth which growth which but there was no investment. Growth which but there was no efficiency improvement. যার জন্য এই weaknesses গুলো যখন রিভিল হতে শুরু করবে then এই 20 থেকে real GDP growth rate, private investment which is already low সেখান থেকে কমতে শুরু করবে। তারপরে আমাদের foreign exchange reserve, tax GDP ratio কম ছিল, তারপর থেকে আরো কমতে শুরু করবে। ইনফ্লেশন অনেকখানি কম ছিল, বাড়তে শুরু করবে 2023 থেকে। সো এবং 24-এ এসে কিন্তু 24 সাল থেকে কিন্তু ইন্টারিম গভর্নমেন্ট এই ফিসক্যাল ইয়ারে তখনও দায়িত্ব নেয় ওই পর্যন্ত দেখেন সেগুলো তার একটাই কারণ যে enough attention was not given to the reform agenda, because reform is something which is very unpopular. only courageous, bold, and very committed leadership can pursue that and become successful. Because there are lots of examples. Even এখন যে এই interim government-এর সময় কিছু কিছু reform-এর যা হয়েছে, thanks to the interim government, অনেকগুলো reform, অনেকগুলো commission হয়েছে, অনেকগুলো reform individually, separately শুরু হয়েছে, but then they also faced a lot of challenges, despite the fact that অনেক capable advisor ছিলেন, they know where the shoe pinches. কিন্তু reform-এর জন্য সবসময় একটা যে barrier resistance, ওইটারও একটা naked display আমরা দেখতে পেলাম even in this period. So সেই রকম একটা পরিস্থিতিতে যদি next government আসে, তখন তাদেরকে শিক্ষিত করি right from day one, they have to come up with this commitment যে ফর্ম করবে। তারা জানে, আমরা তো ইতিমধ্যে দেখছি যে নির্বাচনী ইশতেহার দিয়েছে দলগুলো, বড় বড় দলগুলো, বিশেষ করে দুটো বড় দল যারা কম্পিট করছে দুটোতে বসে, তারা কিন্তু এই ইশতেহারে অনেক ধরনের ambitious টার্গেট দিচ্ছে। সেটা জিডিপি গ্রোথের ব্যাপারে, জিডিপি সাইজের ব্যাপারে দিয়েছে, রেভিনিউ কালেকশনের ব্যাপারে দিয়েছে, প্রাইভেট ইনভেস্টমেন্ট, ফরেন ইনভেস্টমেন্ট, এই সমস্ত অনেক টার্গেট দিয়েছে। খুবই sounds very attractive. এমনকি সোশ্যাল সেক্টরে ইয়ে করা, ইমপ্রুভমেন্ট সোশ্যাল সেক্টর, ফর এক্সাম্পল হেলথ, এডুকেশন, সোশ্যাল প্রোটেকশনে অনেক ইনক্রিজ করার দিয়েছে। বাট এইগুলার, for example, just take one example, $1 trillion economy by 2034, given by, suggested by or aimed by BNP. That requires a growth of about 9% constantly for the next 8-9 years consecutive. But for that, do we have the strong institutions? Do we have good governance? Do we have skilled and committed human resources or government officials? Is our bureaucracy ready for that? Is our technological preparedness in place? No. So that's why, so they would know, the other party also has another target about make the economy, size of the economy 2 trillion by 2040. That requires even higher growth, over 10% for 15 years in a row. But where would this growth come from? So they also provided targets for investment, but without reform, this is impossible, and then we will be just circulating, going round and round in the same circle. So the main areas have been touched by Rashid. I wouldn't go there, but one or two I will mention was the issue of the public service, finance management reform that has been mentioned, fiscal framework, trade and investment, and financial sector. These are presented by both Dr. Ashikur and Sattar. I will just mention one area. সেটা হচ্ছে যে employment. কারণ এই যে জুলাই আপরাইজিং মুভমেন্ট যেটা হয়েছিল, this was basically started with the demand for employment, because employment growth at the wage, but there was no employment. Only employment was available in the public sector, but that public sector can provide only about 5% of the total employment requirement. So ওইটার মধ্যে আবার যেহেতু কোটা ছিল আরো সংকুচিত হয়ে the youth were fighting for that. But the fact remains that the economy was not able to, and still is not able to create adequate jobs. So if we have the growth without jobs, that growth doesn't mean anything. And also at the same time, you observe that we had achieved growth, at the same time the inequality had also increased. Gini coefficient is 0.499 or 0.5. It is increasing. So that means there are a lot of anomalies. The numbers have been, the the authenticity of the numbers have been doubted. Of course, we economists have been discussing if there are problems. Even if we discount that, the basic focus of the growth strategy or development strategy has been fundamentally ignored. So, সেজন্য এই যে employment to meet the labor market reform. এখন আমরা দেখছি যে আমাদের ইকোনমিক স্ট্রাকচারটা চেঞ্জ হয়েছে over the years. আমাদের agriculture based economy থেকে manufacture based and then service sector's contribution is the highest. কিন্তু এখানে একটা জিনিস লক্ষণীয় যে agriculture contribution যদিও ইকোনমিতে খুবই কম, কিন্তু about 40% of the labor force is employed in the agriculture sector. What does it mean? A lot of people or world laborers are seasonally employed or seasonally unemployed. So they do not have their jobs throughout the year or during the other period of time apart from harvest period, they do something else. But here, the most important or striking feature is that the manufacturing sector, which could give decent job with higher salary and job stability, some sort of job stability. There we are seeing lowest job creation. Service sector contributes 51% of the GDP, but service sector's contribution to job creation is also the nature of our services is not like large scale service. There are financial sectors, the telecommunication sector, but also other women jobs, our human resources are working abroad. They are engaged in low skill or semi-skilled workers. So we are missing out somewhere that manufacturing is not keeping pace with the job, momentum to create jobs. So this is one, that's why we need to reform the labor market. At the same time, related to this is the reform in the social sector. That meaning that education sector, health sector, the allocation, budget allocation is very poor. But even whatever allocation is made, that is not used properly. And if many of you are here from the private sector, so if we look at the skills, huge skills mismatch. On the one hand, unemployment rate among the youth is very high. Our average unemployment rate is about 3.6, 3.7 or 3.5%, but youth unemployment rate is just double, about 8%. And if you take into consideration need for the employment, education, and training, this is even higher, almost 20%. So, on the one hand, and the other feature is that the higher the educational qualification, higher the unemployment rate. What is stark, contrast? That on the one hand, there are so many youth in the labor market, about 2 million people enter the labor market every year. But on the other hand, employers do not get what they are looking for in these qualified or graduates. So huge skills mismatch. So the education allocation, budget allocation has to be, but also the quality of education, the skills training center, quality of those, governance of those have to be. Same goes for health sector. We also flip about the very low allocation for the health sector. And if we do not have healthy people, how we will contribute to economic development. So that's also another area for another area for reform. The other important area is social protection. What we are observing for a long period of time now, over 3 years now, that we are seeing that inflation in fact started to rise from 2023. So we are observing high inflation, but the salaries and wages have not increased at the same pace. So the jobs are not being created because investment is not there. Investment is also private investment declining. So one of the important fiscal policy of the government is to look after the poor or less low-income families to social protection, but then you need adequate fiscal space for that. But here we are also seeing that the revenue GDP ratio or tax to GDP ratio is declining, which has been amply discussed by the presenters. So I'll just finish by saying that these are the mainly focusing on focus on the economic part and the social policy part. So where we need overhauling. And I hope that in the election manifesto, there are various ambition levels on these also. For social protection, for example, family cards are promised by BNP and the other parties. Jamaat also has talked about a card for the farmers and other social protection measures. But then they will have to manage or mobilize resources, and without reform in the whole public financing mechanism, there will be no way that they can fund it. So they have to have a robust fiscal strategy framework to do that. I think with this I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. for bringing up quite a few reform areas which need regional attention for the next government. First of all, you said that reforms we need real strong commitment and bold groups, not just soft, it's not the soft part of the global board. So, but most importantly, what I aspect in mind, we're not doing well, but 11% of GDP, agriculture is more than 40%. That's not a good situation. And manufacturing jobs have been on decline. Actually, the share of GDP has come to about 25%. But the interesting and good thing is that half of that export oriented. Now, export oriented manufacturing creates more jobs than domestic market oriented. That is where we want to look for more job creation. But provided that we also have trade regime, which is promoting export, not with so much of anti-export buyers and trade. So trade could be an engine of employment generation. That on the macro level, trade treats that we are seeing Bangladesh experience is the export-oriented manufacturing that creates much more jobs than the domestic market. So this one, look at it's all so evident. So that is where we have to go. That's where we have jobs. We have the reform agenda. So much for the Dr. Young College, Dr. Murshid, Chairman of Policy Security, for his ideas and
Thank you, Dr. Sattar, today's session chair, Chief Guest, Dr. Salehuddin Ahmed, Finance Advisor, special guest, Dr. Murshid, my good friend Clinton from Australian Commission, my very dear younger brother. The kids also have a younger brother, Dr. Ashikur Rahman. And my fellow panelists, Dr. Ahmed, distinguished participants. A very good afternoon, Assalamu alaikum. Indeed, a great pleasure to join this event, which I think comes at the cusp of the time, as we await an election-led transition to much awaited elected democratic government in less than 72 hours. 3 days, I think, and perhaps a government soon after that. I think the economic reform agenda for the next government, a discussion on that could not have been more timely. And the reason I say that, I think building on the traumatic experience from democracy
electoral quality, governance and economy, over between 2009 and 24, and the mass uprising and the promises and aspirations from there, Bangladesh is now on triple transition, what I call triple transition. Transitioning to an elected government and deepening the democratic march or deepening the democratic march. Second, restoring governance in all aspects, state, society, economy. And third, reconstructing the economy and hopefully bouncing back to a high growth path. So in light of these three or this triple transition, the economic reform agenda for the next government, I see at least three motivations or entry point as to why or what should shape that economic reform agenda. Dr. Ashikur Rahman very eloquently articulated in his presentation a number of these issues: financial sector stability, inflation, I think taxation, public finance, and he mentioned very rightly the macro shock, the macro challenge the country landed into from May 2022. Mainly stemming from avoidable policy failures and governance collapse in the years leading up to May 2022. So, what the interim government inherited on 8th of August 2024 as broken economy, as our respected finance advisor often very rightly says, an economy in the ICU, perhaps with the life support mask on. I think certainly it's not in the cabin, but it's not out of the hospital. It's not walking, it's not even back at home. But the next government's first motivation, economic reform agenda, is to continue the deepening of the macro stabilization that was initiated by the interim government, including the central bank of after August 2024. The work started, early success, but the work is far from over. The second motivation I see is long-standing structural and productivity and efficiency oriented reforms, which have not really moved in the last 15 years or some even since before. And linked to that are our unleashing the full scale of our long-term growth drivers, which can take us to the next phase of growth. The third agenda that I see is aspirations that over the short and medium term, which is also reflected partly or largely in the manifesto that Ahmed also referred to, of at least the large two main contending parties in the election. Now, that's my first point. These three perspectives or windows really will continue to shape the economic reform agenda. My second point: what are the reform avenues? I have a two-tiered approach to share with you. I think the next government economic reform agenda have 4 strategic approaches and perhaps 6 to 7 vertical or transformational approaches. And this builds on both the issues of the macro challenge we have landed in and somewhat stabilized in some of the areas, but also on the long-term growth drivers. The 4 strategic approach on the economic reform agenda, I see, as I said, first continuing the deepening of the macro stabilization. Based on work since August 2024, yes, as Ashik said, inflation is down from close to 13% to 8.6 or so. However, it's still very high. Until we bring it down to 6.5, domestic demand is going to be dampened, which will continue to affect negatively the output as well as continue to find low income and middle income people. Balance of payment is now back to positive, both current account and financial account and overall balance of payment. However, as well as I must mention, very strong early recovery in reserves. Net reserve IMF BPM went down from, I think, as low as $19 billion in August 24. I think it's up to $27 billion. Taka rates have remained stable over the last 17, 18 months. However, when we expect the confidence to strengthen, business confidence, political government to take up more development expenditure or projects, imports are going to go up. And for us to go back to a 5.5–6% growth rate, a $26 billion reserve is not enough. We must push it up towards 35 and perhaps even higher. And as our imports go up, energy bills, import bills go up, our debt payment servicing obligations go up, the demand for dollars are going to go up as well. Hopefully, exports and remittances will keep up, but we will certainly see pressure. That's going to put pressure on the exchange rate as well. So there is a lot to do on the macroeconomic details. That's my first point. Second, getting the economic growth drivers, particularly private investment, including FDI, exports, small business, leading to employment, back to a growth trajectory. Investment has been sluggish, and it is not a surprise. I mean, we are going through an interim arrangement. There has been a lot of issues with law and order, protests, electoral uncertainties, at least until August 2025, and that is bound to hurt investment competitiveness. And of course, we have long-standing reforms as well. So investment GDP ratio is falling down towards 22%. FDI has always been a problem. So how do we get it back? How do we get exports to weather the 4 months, 5 months continuous drop, the difficult days in the European Union, whether it's for competitive pressure that would extend after the LLC graduation, or India's 0% access into EU, or China or India's aggressive marketing in the European Union because of higher taxes in the United States that Bangladesh is unable to match because we don't have the equally strong backward linkage or value chain support within the country. So how do we get it back to a level with growth drivers? And small businesses, they have been primarily suffering for sluggish demand and high interest rates. Small business since 2022, last 16–17 months have not been also very helpful for them because of frequent protests, disruptions, and pockets of law and order issues around the country. So this is my second point in the strategic approach. The third is the economic governance. Unlike the macro, the interim government has started restoring the economic governance very strongly in the banking sector. Ashik mentioned, freeing the bank boards from oligarchs, saving the banks from daylight looting by a weekly basis, and also asset quality review and several others. But many more work needs to be done to strengthen this economic governance from Bangladesh Bank order, or which is currently ordinance for its own legal independence. Bangladesh Bank's operational capacity enhancement and operational independence. Bank Companies Act reforms, money loan code reforms, distressed asset management company to deal with NPLs in a market-based way. A lot of this work are yet to be done, and banking is not the only part of the financial sector. There's insurance, there's capital market. Unfortunately, banking perhaps requires such urgent and large attention. Capital market and insurance governance restoration is a long-drawn agenda that's pending over there. And unless we develop the remaining elements of the financial sector in an equal way, pressure on banking will continue to remain, and banks being forced to finance medium to long terms up to 7 years instead of only short-term financing will continue to create asset liability duration mismatch, and we will see NPLs coming out of that as well. So capital market insurance equally required. We also have to take care of some more unwell banks. I think 5 banks consolidation was the right approach. I wish government did not go for creation of another public sector banks, because now getting that feasible is going to be an uphill task. But there are more banks that need to be consolidated because they cannot survive on their own, including NBFIs. How do we handle that? Part of the economic governance stem to energy, power and energy sector. Again, interim government has done fairly well by stopping oligarchs or crony behavior in power and energy sector. But the sector still remains vulnerable in many ways. What we do with Adani, what we do with rising LNG, what we do with domestic gas and other energy support is also heavily dependent on not only strategy, but also economic governance. And Last part of the economic governance I will refer to is public sector investment management and quality of public expenditure. Again, early success, project leakages were a day-to-day affairs until in August 2024. That has largely stopped, but not fully, not easy to completely eliminate that. But that battle remains on the governance restoration front. The fourth strategic approach I would mention is to introduce comprehensive, integrated, time-bound economic reforms. Of course, there were some reforms, certainly as we mentioned in banking, in some of the foreign exchange related ones. But we need a lot more in an integrated way. Trade liberalization, trade policy, trade facilitation, investment climate, tax reform, public investment management or public finance reforms, and many others. So that economic reform agenda in an integrated way is going to be fourth strategic approach. The 7 areas, Dr. Sattar, I'll finish with that because I'm on the 9th, 10th meeting. The 7 areas that I would mention are first, the public, the transformational one, dealing with inflation, dealing with balance of payment, dealing with monetary policy, how do we manage the inflation in a rather expedited way so that we can actually go for a bit of monetary easing, moving away gradually from restricting monetary or contractionary monetary policy and high policy rates to supporting business or investment supporting interest rate. So a macro management strategy is going to be important. Managing our import and forecasting our import demand is going to be also very critical. Second one, public financial management reforms. Finance division has rolled out the public financial management strategy 2025-2030 in December. And that is a very comprehensive document, provides very detailed suggestions as to what needs to be done. So implementation of that for public finance is going to be important, and linked to that is rationalizing public debt, particularly foreign debt. If you have noticed one number, Bangladesh's overall foreign debt payment in fiscal 24-25 increased by 17% compared to the previous fiscal year, and it is continuing to rise. So how do we rationalize that so that we manage debt obligation, but also create other space for development finance, including from foreign sources, and certainly the perennial issue of tax reform. So that's the second part. The third, export competitiveness for both diversification and for a post-NDC world. Some of the details Ashik mentioned, Dr. Sattar also mentioned, so I'm not going into that. A very systematic investment climate reform, not just big bang or flashy transaction ideas or events, but real integrated investment climate reform. Power and energy, renewable, domestic gas, absolutely critical. How do you manage the import demand or rising import demand or need on LNG over the 5 to 10 years? It's going to be extremely important. Banking stability, I think, requires no new introduction. I mentioned some of the priorities. And finally, targeted job support, employment creation. Of course, the most sustainable way of creating gainful employment would be through private investment driven by global market, global value chain participation and small businesses. But employment is in such difficult scenario, particularly with regard to educated youth employment, declining female participation in the labor force. There is need to undertake targeted labor market support to create access and access to jobs by these vulnerable groups, by these sensitive population pockets, and create the economic opportunity that everybody should get. So I'd like to thank PRI once again for giving me the opportunity, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Murshid. You have looked at this reform agenda in a very systematic way, and we really appreciate you taking the trouble. The agenda is very well formulated. Thanks to your thoughts. Just to mention, the foreign exchange reserve situation, I think we are moving close to where we have what we call a comfort zone. The import coverage in terms of funds by the IMF BPM6 criteria, we are at 4.9. And by the usual, Bangladesh criteria, which is says $2.8 billion, we are into 5.7. 6 months, if we exceed 6 months, equal coverage, we be in a very good coverage. So we're getting close to that. So that's the good thing. And all of your points, the four strategic approach that you talked about now, we all agree. There's no disagreement. You also outlined the subheads as well. So thank you again for a very strategic treatment of technology. And now invite now I think it's time for opening the floor to discussion. So we invite people to raise their questions. So I'd like to invite a question. So this to be time is a good thing. So I'd like you to please let's ask your question if you please. And if you have an observation, just 1 minute would be the max. So we invite so always very from
Honourable Adviser, Dr. Zaidi Sattar, thank you very much. I'll try to be quick. Dr. Ashik talked about bold reforms, and we heard about lots of reform. And I think there are many bold reforms, but the way I describe bold reforms are those that are contentious. And I think one of the most contentious reforms, and you alluded to that, is of course protectionism. And typically, in many countries, you have protection is put in place in order to build domestic capability. It's an industrial policy, you build capability. But oftentimes what happens is over time, it becomes a source of revenue, especially on imports, and then it becomes hard to remove it. What usually doesn't get assessed is how that protection has impacted domestic industry, the growth of domestic industry. Has it become competitive enough? And I'm raising this issue is because it is indeed contentious. And I think Dr. Zaidi, you talked about it. Globally, the experience is once the protection is removed, yes, there might be a dip in revenue, but over time the revenue increases, tax revenue from that we collect. But I think in order to make a strong case for addressing or removing protectionism, I think that question about protectionism and its impact on domestic industry can be raised, and I can understand there are factors of political economy. So this could be something that might help to push these reforms through. Thank you very much.
Thank you for bringing the issue of protectionism into things. And can I just inform you that at the other end of protection are the consumers, and the Bangladeshi consumers, honestly speaking, I mean, the poor consumers in Bangladesh have been bearing this protection burden, the tax burden of protection for 54 years without knowing whether this protection is going to ultimately go down to some decent levels. Bangladesh is a very highly protected society, and it simply can't, and it's not producing revenue. Sometimes we hear the argument that, okay, the tariffs are high because we need the revenue. That argument is now falls flat because what revenue we are getting, 6.6% of GDP, is the lowest revenue effort, low effort on even developing countries. Okay, so thank you so much for raising the protection issue. May I invite Mr. Ashikur Rahman, President of NCCI?
Thank you very much, Dr. Zaidi Sattar. I think this was a very interesting discussion, and having heard all the panelists along with the presenter, I must say, as far as stabilization of the economy is concerned, I think the Ministry of Finance and the Bangladesh Bank has done a good job. Nevertheless, inflation is still high. We need to bring it down a little more. And I've heard Bangladesh Bank governor say time and again that until and unless the rate of inflation is brought down to 5 to 6%, we might not be able to bring down the rate of interest. But then again, at these high rate of interest, borrowing, business is finding it extremely difficult to operate at these high rates. And as far as private sector investments are concerned, it has come almost to a grinding halt. We need to see that investments are back on track. Now, everybody is on a wait and see mode, waiting for the election, waiting for the new government. But then again, as soon as a new government comes in, investment is not going to start automatically. They are also going to see what the policies are going to be like. Now, Dr. Sattar, you have mentioned very rightly about the India-EU free trade agreement, which has been described as a mother of all trade deals, and also the India-US trade deal, which is at 18%. We are probably going to reach that figure also. If that happens, our exports vis-a-vis India will probably be all right. However, there is one other thing that has not been mentioned today. I haven't heard anybody mention, which is the LDC graduation. If India-EU trade deal starts functioning, it's going to start anytime now, along with an LDC graduation by the end of the year, we will be in trouble. Unless we are able to find something with EU. But as far as US is concerned, we'll probably be all right. I've heard employment being mentioned time and again. It's true, youth employment is very high. What is most important to note is we have got very high unemployment in general and underemployment. And as far as education is concerned, I think we need to revisit our curriculum, because industry domestically, as well as jobs available overseas, there is a skills mismatch. Industry is not getting the right people, and we are also not able to send the right people overseas. If we just take a look at what an average Bangladeshi migrant worker is sending home or earning, as opposed to an average Indian migrant worker, there's a big difference. They are earning much more than us. And if we compare with an average Sri Lankan migrant worker, their average earning is much higher. It's probably 3 to 4 times. And it's only because of us sending unskilled workers as opposed to them sending skilled workers. There are several other points that I've written, but I don't think I'll be able to finish in a minute. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rahman, for bringing up the issue of LDC graduation and India-EU FTA all at the same time, the two shocks at the same time, that will be not much breathing space. So that means reform, radical reform are immediately that will be the situation.
So, Honourable President of the Australian Chamber of Commerce. Well, first of all, I must give thanks to 3 doctors today here, even these people. Okay, wonderful. I have some points to discuss, but already everything is covered. So thank you very much. And today the word discussion, I think everybody take it as a lot of knowledge. That's the whole back. First of all, is the information, the project, the agenda which you are now discussing, which is for the next government. Whoever comes, I remember. But only the very good thing, the agendas of the both coming parties, they're wonderful. Everything covered. I don't know whether they can implement it, but the information and the requirement, what is needed in the country, it is already covered by them. I hope they will follow these things and they will try to make it in a successful. But one important issues today, I don't know, the total all conglomerates of the country and financial sector are in a critical position. So that's why our GDP growth is 4.2% now coming up 4.2%. So this must be taken up to above 6%. And for that, as the economic agendas of the both parties comes from the government, they must take very serious issues. And obviously, the 80% of the growth, the economy is the growth is depending on the private sector. And if they cannot take in consideration the private sector, that growth never comes. So this is very important. And today I must recommend that the private sector must give the preference to participate in the economic growth of the country. And that only possible. There are a lot of other things to discuss, but it is not the right time now because now Maghrib is now already started. So I hope next time, if we have the opportunity, we can discuss a lot of things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for pointing out this strategic point, which is the private sector is the driver, is a growth driver. Yes. So the private sector has to be given the space to do what they do best. However, I have to also remind you that the sector, part of the private sector, particularly the private sector that is focused on the domestic market, they are just too interested in seeing the domestic market to be as closed as possible. This is not a private sector that will take the economy forward. What do you say? The private sector of the future, the private sector of the future, must recognize that the Bangladesh economy is now more integrated with the world economy compared to what it was 35 years ago. So they must also start living in this integrated world, which means that they have to acknowledge that they have to accept more competition. Just closing the economy with mountain of tariffs and just, so that pollution between private sector and, those who resist reform. That needs to close. Thank you very much. May I now, so I think, yes, please, anyway, our friends from the Japanese.
Yes. Assalamualaikum. I'm Nadir Zaman Khan, Director of Bangladesh Digital Business Association and Managing Director of Institute. So basically, I'd like just to thank you all of the panels for putting up all the agendas that I've gone through. I need some more time to go through all those, but I'd like to say some key points. As you know that we have faced a lot of problems for last few months and last few years regarding the textiles. We contribute about 13% of the GDP in Bangladesh. And we have seen that we get incentive about 1.2 or 1% around 1% right now, which was introduced 25% on 1990s by ex-Prime Minister Mr. Ashikur Rahman. Regarding those, we are facing a lot of backlashes and roadblocks through which was guaranteed by the previous government that we're going to get uninterrupted gas, but we're not getting it anymore. The gas price is still high for us, whereas the gas price in the international market is down right now. On the other hand, we are facing a lot of backlashes regarding the export with our neighboring countries. We are fighting with them, as we know that we are going through LDC graduation in near future. What are the safeguards we are putting up with the new policies right now? On the last point, I'd like to tell that we have seen that other countries like India or other countries which are competitive to us, they take decisions on the policies within 7 days. But in Bangladesh, it takes 7 months or more than 7 months. So when are we going to rectify those and come to a conclusion? Thank you.
I think it's good that you pointed out that there is a new thing that's a new act that you have wanted to see, the Buy American Cotton Act 2025, that is going to create new situations, and I think BGMA and BGMA will have to coordinate their activities in order that Bangladesh could get the benefit of that. Using imported inputs from America and getting some tax-free benefits for our export. That's I'm sure the next government will have to look at it very carefully. I have, in order to invite our Japanese friend, this Bangladesh Japan EPA is such a enormous achievement for the Bangladesh government and Bangladesh Japan friendship over the last 4 years. So I'm going to invite your comments here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so first of all, congratulations to execute the EPA February 6th. Actually, on that day is both sides, the two government side as a general election campaign period. Maybe the Japanese side we finished 3 days before Bangladesh election. So if you see this fact, EPA execution during this period means Japanese government. I'm not coming from Japanese government, I'm from private sectors. But even though it is a real, as Mr. Chairman explained to all of us, it's a really strong commitment from Japanese government. And we, Japanese private sector, also we are very much in line with Japanese government. And for instance, our companies or maybe many Japanese is now concentrate on the domestic market. So we are importing things to this country. But if you see other Southeast Asia, some of the countries now slowing down on the manufacturing. And what we think is coming to the US means Bangladesh. So by having this huge resource for market, we'd like to expand our business not only for import for this market, but by capturing this huge market, want to do that instead of import, but do the manufacturing. Actually, these import products. Then we can import global products. In coming few years later, then we may start export business because one of our difficulties is to open the LC or increase to the foreign currency reserve. So we also would like to contribute for export business. So import, investment, and export. And this export surely will contribute to this country to increase the foreign reserve. So for that part, the Japanese group want to collaborate together by having support of the government. Yeah, maybe that is the ideas of the Japanese group. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. This EPA is not just important as the first, close to a free trade agreement. It's an agreement with asymmetrical reciprocity. Bangladesh getting more favorable treatment compared in this arrangement. So that's a great monumental achievement. I think Bangladesh already is exporting something like $1.5 billion to Japan. And Japan is the fourth largest economy in the world, so it's a huge market. So this particular agreement opens up market access like, I mean, and it has been done within just 1 year of association. Fantastic. So much. I think we have to move to special guest, and then to our chief guest. World Bank, okay, World Bank senior economist wants to share some comments.
Thank you.
And we'll move.
Thank you, sir. I'm senior economist. So, I'll be very short. Maybe I'll just want to re-emphasize the need of employment and jobs here. So we have already discussed a lot of things on this, but I think for the next government, it will be very critical to understand the different incentive structure and the interplay that is going on here. So the role of the government obviously is not to create jobs. Of course, they want to create jobs, but what they can do is to create an environment for the private sector to create jobs. But on the other hand, when private sector invests, they don't look to create jobs. I mean, of course, they create jobs, but they are aiming to maximize their profits. So it's going to be important to understand like where exactly we need to incentivize and which are the sectors to focus. These are the areas that are which is not very easy, but I think we need to have a better understanding. And also the structural transformation on employment that we usually saw in other South Asian countries who have been successful, moving from an agricultural-based employment to manufacturing to services. Whether that ladder still exists because of the automation and AI, that we also need to see in more details. And whether manufacturing is the future or whether we should focus on more on services and how we can do that. These are the things. And also the importance of FDI, I think, which we partly discussed, but not in very details. And we also talk about the employment in the youth unemployment, the employment among the educated youth. To solve that, I think there is no alternative to increase the FDI. I mean, there is no other countries which is growing at a very fast rate and having a net FDI of 0.5% of GDP. That is also important to improve the corporate culture and the quality of jobs, and also on the impact on the foreign exchange reserves. So the source of our foreign earning is very much concentrated in remittance and exports, and we need to diversify that. And on the reserves, a quick point to note, we talked about the reserves in months of imports, but it might be useful to also look at the reserves in terms of prospective imports. So the imports has been very low in the past 2-3 years. So when we calculate the reserves in terms of imports, it looks very high, but we expect the imports to go up in the next 2-3 years. So in that respect, I think we have a long way to go in terms of taking the reserves to an expected level.
Yeah, we should work on the basis of, when we talk about coverage, months coverage, perspective improvement. Thank you for pointing out. I think we can now to our designated presenters. First of all, our special guest, Dr. K.A.S. Murshid, who is a leading economist of the country and also the former Director General of the IDS, and also Chairman of the National Task Force on developing strategic economic policies. And he's presenting a very thick 600-page report for the interim. Dr. Murshid.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, Honourable Chief Guest of Honor, and with the panelists, and the very distinguished audience. Good evening to all of you. It's been already quite a long session. We can do that. So, I will try to be more brief than I usually am. Now, the first point I think I would like to mention is that when we talk about a macro, we obviously quite logically focus on macro variables and interest rates, reserves, so. But we also tend to forget that there is a clear macro-micro linkage. In other words, there are what we would call the micro foundations of macroeconomics in a development context as economy. And that actually requires a focused attention on key micro variables if we want to actually ensure macro stability. Now, a very good example might be if suddenly we are forced to import a very large amount of food, then that alone can cause quite a major blow to our balance of trade. So that's what I mean. So there are various ways in which the real sectors and institutions and markets affect macro balance. In other words, macro stability is far more complex than we. Now, reforms are very good. I mean, we've been talking about reforms for a very long time. And interesting thing about reforms is, if you look back at our economic history, the only time when you see significant reforms taking place is when the IMF twists our arms. Now, I can't really think of many events in our history where we have independently said that, look, I mean, we agree that these reforms are important and should be implemented, but we do not take that step in implementing any reform until and unless we are forced. Now, in a way that has an explanation. I think the reason really is that the political economic backlash that reforms usually generate is something that most governments is unable. And only when there is external pressure, we kind of say, look, there's nothing else we can do. Sorry, buddy, we have to carry this set of reforms through. So we will have to get out of that. I mean, we can imagine a situation right now, for example, where we are faced with imminent NDC graduation. I don't know whether the current discussions around delaying graduation by 3 years is going to be fruitful. But even if it is, the problem is not going to be perfect. We also have major gaps in SDG achievements. And to make some dent in these areas, people have to engage in urgent reforms, which necessarily will not come as a pressure point from IMF or the World Bank. We'll have to feel the pressure ourselves because the external climate has changed, geopolitics has changed. We are going through a very troubled set of times. And therefore, when we have this internal burden upon us, without an external burden, we have to think about delivery. How are we going to deliver reforms? Now, this is something, I mean, we can say that we want one-stop services in data, we want well-functioning special economic zone, we want to carry through, all the key reforms of the NDR or the banking sector or RJO, any public services. We've been saying this, but we have not been able to deliver on very much. At best, some partial achievements have been made. But I mean, if you just think of digitalization as part of reform, and look at any of the public service institutions that have digitalized, I mean, very soon as a user, you will figure out that this is not really digitalization because there is always some way of turning the system into an analog system. So you're back to the same old problem. So, in other words, delivery remains the biggest problem in reforms and in economic policy. Now, obviously, this needs very careful institutional. And one of the things in the task force that we tried to sort of really emphasize was that, look, if we just say that we need to have reforms across large number of sectors, try to implement those. Bound to be. Government doesn't have the capacity. Now, can we at least identify one or two core reforms and really focus on that, using all the capacity that the government has? And just, and make, and show some success. We need to show some success. In order to be able to say, look, yes, we tried this out and we have succeeded, even if it is at a relatively small scale. This transition is crucial. And we've been talking about this, the voices have become hoarse talking about this, but, nobody seems to really care. I mean, we do not have reforms across the whole landscape all at once. Right? So we need to be strategic. Okay, maybe we can have some other way of handling this, but we need to be strategic. So, and what is that strategy? It's something that we have to deliberate. Now, so one of the things that we have tried to mention in the task force is that there are various reforms that we talk about. Now, we have to approach this in a systematic way. So we actually need some kind of institution, like a regulatory reform commission, that will be solely engaged in looking at policy reforms, researching on policy, looking at extremes of other, and making recommendations to the government. Now, this institutional gap is there to be addressed. And without this, one fails to see how we can actually move from just talking about reform to doing something. Now, the second gap that I see in government is that you have all these ministries, and we have all our brilliant economists and our brilliant private sector. We're all saying that do this, do that. We have hundreds of recommendations coming. Who cares? Does the government care? Yes, they do, in a way. But there is no mechanism to address these internally. I mean, there must be somebody or some cell in the Ministry of Agriculture who will say, okay, the economists are talking about aging reforms. Let's review this and let's discuss this internally. And then let's talk to our minister and see where we can go from here. Does that happen? I don't think so. Dr. Salehuddin Ahmed is here. And I hope that he can throw some light on it. But these, links in the chain are crucial gaps in our implementation meetings. So first, we all know about the problem of project design and hiking costs and time. And the problem of finding appropriate leaders, project directors, the lack of monitoring event, all this is there. Again, what is missing here? We don't have a proper, independent, third-party monitoring and evaluation. The so-called IME is neither third-party nor is it. So we should change their name, number one. And number two, we should actually have a proper institutional approach to this problem that will actually provide a third-party monitoring and evaluation perspective on reform. Without that, I mean, I'm implementing and I'm also doing the monitoring, and that's ridiculous. So in my view, in order to sort of decide on actions and intervention constraints, there are a number of things we have to look at. We have to look at who benefits. And youth, or women, or workers, or which income quantile, rural or urban. This needs to be very clear. Because we just talk about projects and not sort of as abstraction, and every project is good for everybody. That's not the case. So we need to be quite clear about what we are being paid for. Now we need to also identify civic binding instruments. Like the skeleton of somebody said, like the infrastructure they need, activity skill, demand. Or is it the political economy that keeps on? You just look at the Chittagong port situation. And every time you want to reform anything, even when you're trying to reform Dhaka's traffic light signaling system, you have this huge pushback from existing vested forces. Now, what is our plan address that. We don't have that plan. There must be a mechanism. We just cannot come up with something and say, hey, from tomorrow we will launch this program. No, that will not succeed. You have to do your homework. You have to prepare the exam. You have to go to the state conference. And then maybe it can succeed. Also, one reform also requires other reform, because you need complementary reform. And often we in our discussion we forget about. Political economy we have talked about, so I will know that. But it's again at the end of the day, that's probably most important. So again, drawing from the task force, we said that okay, we cannot do everything all at once. We cannot engage suddenly on a huge, massive operation. But a practical solution would be to pilot, to prove that the pilot works, and then to try and scale it up. Especially if we're doing something new. But for a government that will be coming into power, say, in its time, you already have, well set of existing and ongoing and planned programs and projects. So you don't really have to sort of go beyond that too much. You can start there. And you can say, these things haven't worked. These need to be activated or reactivated. Because progress has been slow. Outcomes are less than efficient. Results are close to zero. And if we keep on sort of saying that we spent 80% of the money and therefore we are successful 80% in terms of the project result, that's not a good way of dealing with it. So actually, the government has enough on its place. It's there. It's ongoing. You have to reactivate it. And in order to do that, I think also the private sector, people have been waiting for elections. People have not been investing in part, not just because of the interest rate, but also because of lack of confidence. And restoring and maintaining that confidence is the most important issue in the next few months. And that will actually require that from day one, we prevent any large-scale untoward incidents in terms of stabilizing our order or public confidence, security anyway. That is going to be very critical. If that cannot be done, then let's forget talking about it. So we know that BNP and Ashikur Rahman, they have a plan. I think others also have a plan. But we also need to understand the fast changing geopolitics, and this is changing. And therefore, I don't think we can be very strict about it right away. But diversification is going to be key. But the two elements, I think one has been mentioned to a certain extent, the social dimensions. I think the youth and the social dimensions currently very positive. And we need to go. Next government will have to need to address that. Not just in terms of aspirations, but in terms of the youth facing multiple interrelated crises, not just unemployment, which talk about a lot. We don't talk about the drug addiction, which has actually quite epidemic proportion. We don't talk about online gambling, which is actually increasing according to some sources at 300% a year. We don't talk about as much gang violence and gender-based violence. These are all now very, very real dangers that can, again, I say the micro foundations can destabilize. So there's much to be accomplished, and we hope that next government will be.
That reform that you initiate, there's a huge pushback from Western forces. So how strongly, how politically, how effectively the government leadership is in order to push through reforms. Reforms have to be pushed through. It's understood to be good for what is in the national interest and not the interest of some rest of all. And the other one you point out is setting up a reform commission, that's very interesting. Maybe that might be necessary, but we hope it's not a commission that would be talks about reforms, health reform, gender, but not much of this. So, thank you for these points. Now I think it's time for us to go to the that part of that segment of this event. We are all been waiting for the speech from our chief guest, Dr. Salehuddin Ahmed, Honourable Adviser, Ministry of Finance, and I would leave him with 2 or 3 questions. And I would say, what do you think? Is there reform, the energy for reforms, their commitment for reforms? And again, the interim government has basically kicked the can down the road. Only reform could be put in, and Dr. Salehuddin has been at the top of those reforms. Many, I think there are many reform formulations under him, but how much of that got implemented? So, is it going to be next government as on the agenda? There were are they going to be committed to get things done? After our chief guest has spoken, we will have closing remarks from our board director, Dr. Ahmed himself on leading the critical comments. Thank you. In fact, I take a position I'm not responding to the government thing. I take 2 or 3 minutes. When I'm in the thick of it, I know what it's about. Very always before. Because I know what is the shape of the country, where they come from them. Which has political thing. So the government does, we try to do something, and we will say that we are demand for the job, to finish it off, but study. And I must convene. There are so many things you have mentioned. Now let's set up some priorities and timing also, because so many things cannot be done. The take also 10 years, but there are 2 governments to implement it. So prioritize is a 7 years time prioritize something. We started with the problem of inflation and the VOP, financial account deficit, blah, blah, blah. So we said, so I don't know, we have seen that contract, independent contract or the amount of number, astonishing. We have been told by the High Court that we knew this contract. And those are so distorted, and we try to revise it, we could do it. Anyway, I don't know, not a big deal, we can do that, but it was difficult, but we tried to, especially I tried to take people after I wanted to, because I once basically, first thing Professor asked whether the government will try to do that. I told him 1 or 2 occasions before then that whatever we have started is around one-offs. We continue definitely, which not. You have to choose, you have to prioritize and take the some of them. These are not our morning and Madhuri Misha coordinate. These are all fake need of them. Must admit that. And I told the politician that if you don't want to implement, because it's not IMF prescription or World Bank prescription, not all their prescriptions are bad. They wanted our attention to some things that you have to do. Then I told that unless you do it, it's not a country, but good of the country. So actually I gave that message. In privately, they after the party department. Those are the conscious, they know it. And we have failed on judging. We are narrative For example, why it has gone down? Because definition of a pay. Our financial 10% first payment, second payment, 2% area can pay that. Manage it again, doing the receipt. So each of them comes to the recovery store. I don't remember the word I said, right? Definition and pay below. You have anywhere, don't go to that. First thing, what I would like, and I told, then we should consolidate on some of the, what was starting. The problem with political and government is called political account. Building points. They will have the cumulative table. Something that's something good to build on. So our suggestion is to them that please consolidate some of these for them and try to take it very fast. Slow, you cannot go very slowly. Second thing is, in government and everywhere there is a lack of audit. Well, the Minister of Finance, I said, very bodies have seen. It's very difficult to implement anything because of the lack of coordination and also ability to reform. I'm not going into detail. Reform shall be put in time. Some of the status quo, especially there are dynamic people, those who are very challenging and especially they want to go forward. And there are pushy jobs, including, I work day to day. They want the tag every time. Ultimately, I retire. So this is kind of inertia. That is a kind of problem with the country. So, and we don't have a new normal. We have to face the geopolitical situation and also. I am privileged to talk about the finance minister of much time. The finance minister and the state trade. The very important. I tell you one thing. I'm not going to be criticized for it. I didn't get to know you are doing something good, but challenges are formidable. What are they want us? The political culture is not enough. But to the look at the field part of the class. They start with that. The what you have done and the speak for one country, when what it totally economic forum, but what you are doing something, but you have to go further very quickly. So in this EPA is very importantly, I differ with the legislation, they have given enough benefits to us, and we are not giving enough benefits to us. Never people, they have not given considerable time. They know it's a winning game. So I'm not going to be the last. Why did I go to 9,000? I'm going to go to 9,000. That's not the way to do it. We start with first Apple out, and that's only our going to stay, and the government can actually do it. The situation. We start with something. And second, about the IRT, I'm not giving detail about that. All of this deal they use not bad. So you know that the exit clause also, shopkeepers are not all of it. Exit clause that say the notification time or change, you know that notification or that's very implementable. All of them are shopkeepers. So let's see what sorry. So you look at cook car deal now. And it usually deal at every in the vehicle zero. On that reason, in the picture $500 billion. Another part of it. That. Only this better answer. It's not there. But definitely they are we got power in there to deal with this. I know to the graduation of graduation private sector of the Pobke, definitely there are some tasks to be done. Total Baparache, Cancer Baparache, Cancer, as in Bolivia, but we have kept it 26, it's cheap. I mean, Naibuli on private sector, they get a competitive. I've seen the infant industry argument for the last 50 years. Economically, we can't do it. Our corporate, it's an hospital provided. It is like a balloon. If I reduce the tax here, somebody will take the burden, that it's not that easy. আমার একটা ডেইলি স্কিল ওয়ার্কার আছে, বিটিএমই আছে, বিজিএমই আছে, বড় বড় কিছু এটা কমে গেলে আমরা কমে পেট্রোলিয়াম আনতে এটা করতে হবে। But there are so many, there is competing needs, definitely, but I have to, the trade-off also. So it's not very easy to make a policy. And I believe that the popular debate, TV talk show also not there. One of my advisor, there was a talk show called the K.A.S. But then they had talk show, solve. Literally, very seriously, we have the right of doctors. I don't see anything happening in Bangladesh. The kids get the vaccine. We have to lie. There's many, we have tried to reform the institution, very difficult. That is our process that we look at some of the business better than we is simplified with it. And I better should have a vaccine. There are some challenges. And one thing I must tell you, please, don't blame the government or policy. You have to do something also. You know that compliance on our laws and regulations are minimum in this country. I'm not ready to do. I'm not saying e-tax, about 80, you know, 70% people have zero income tax. I was telling you, 70% look at 3 lakh income line. So if people do not comply, people do not give the real statement, how can government do anyway? My son works in the tax department. He is for people voluntarily comes with the information. They give consent to our visa. Another is data pay council you are not funny. It is the compliance law, the enforcement of law and procedures are also very good. And implement the accuracy. Really weakest part of our thing. So anyway, I appreciate this. Note and about last week, about political commitment. I had a talk with them at the highest level. And some of them said that to success and more. I'm not getting this either. Or the asking to that. So that I'll not give a big shopping. I give a story. I've been to Vietnam 5 times. Vietnam, they write a report, 5 pages, and recommended 2 or 3. I'm a French, whatever they write, they take it. And in your country, 10 pages introduction of the country, 15 pages about the weather, 15 pages of people, and 25 recommendations. 30, not 25 recommendations. But how can you implement it? So this is one thing. And এখন এত বেশি আমরা ইউজ করি যেটা আমি বলছিলাম যে আপনারা যেগুলো বলছেন social sector. I cannot give money to the social sector, I know that. World Bank and IMF আমাকে বারবার বলছে আর কত করবো social sector। তবু কালকে না পরশু আমি কিছু পারো না দেখেন না আমাকে একবার বাড়ির জন্য পাবো যাওয়ার আগে অ্যাটলিস্ট 100-200 টাকা পারবে তো একটা আমরা দোয়া করবে। আমি রিসেন্টলি আমার 100-200 টাকা আমার 8,000 কোটি টাকা লেগে চলেছেন যে একটা সেক্টর ভালো। Not that actually you're not done anyway, but we have started something, not that we are saying, and we are also to appreciate something. Appreciation is not that is the political incentive. I mean, fair and আমাকে জানাইবো স্যার আপনি তো সফল খবর না আপনি তো ব্যর্থ প্রচেষ্টা হয়ে যায়। I am sure that that's partly true. I will very good advisor, but governor হিসাবে মোটামুটি বলে কিছুটা এসে ছিল না এত বললাম ছিল না। Anyway, but I tell you, we tried, we didn't have any agenda whatsoever. Under personal agenda, political agenda, we tried, and definitely Bangladesh is not in a bad shape. And political stability, I would say that there is the most of the second one. So, for example, I could be able to struggle even for next shape. Let me give this to the government, we fought in the Washington DC, they give it to the market. Oh yeah, তখন আমার হঠাৎ করে বুদ্ধি বেরোলো বাকিটা দিয়ে দেবো যদি পাঁচটার মধ্যে ওদের বিপদ হতো, তাই না? আমাকে তারপরে সবাই তো মারবে টাকা। So what I did, বলো আমরা $1 million compensating একটা প্যাকেজ দিই। হঠাৎ করে যদি 120 টাকা থেকে 200 টাকা হয়ে যায়, তাহলে ইনজেকশন কিছুদিন মানে না, আর $500 million আগে তোমার চালাকি করে আমি বলছি টাকাটা দিতে হবে যদি আলাদা। Luckily, business people acted well, rationally, export was not bad, revenue is very high, and market also behaved properly, and that is what we achieved because of it. So Bangladesh people are working very efficient, but definitely we have to do. I remember as I ended, T.W. Schultz was an economist, transforming traditional agriculture. That economic what is the long term that? India was not the Bangladesh country, Pakistan also not. Indian farmers are very efficient, very hardworking, but what they need capital investment, incentive, and all that. That's what we also need now. The private sector, especially, that government should come forward to give incentive, proper incentive, not undue, and proper atmosphere to be built. That's what the Bangladesh government. And I think they can boast that for that at least we have made a আমি বলেছি যে খাদ্য নিশ্চয় আমার এক কলিগ বলছে আইসিতে চলে গেছে আমি আবার বলছে ক্যাবিনেট একটা খারাপ না মোটামুটি তা আমার মনে হয় on the way to hope at the next community and we need your cooperation and appreciation and I also thank all of you for it. আমরা কিন্তু এই সব cooperation পেয়েছি but things that people expectation will high too. আজকে আমাকে একজন দিল আমরা চলে যাচ্ছি তো এখন দেন না প্রতিদিন থাকেন আপনার এক্সপেক্টেশন but that's not our thing. But definitely I must thank you. Very useful. Ashikur Rahman আমি নিয়ে যাচ্ছি তাদের দেখি একটা বানাতে হবে আমাকে আমি বলছি আমরা সেকে all section of the কিন্তু আমাদের এক্সপেরিয়েন্স লাইন একটু বড় আমি বলি একবার আমি যেতে পারি না মিটিং what is the RC and my secretary sir your team is giving very good fight against IMF we keep বলছি এই যে সব কথা আপনি বলছেন then we give a fight ওখানে যখন বলে World Bank people are there they are very tough and আমাদের negotiating skill আছে আমাদের কিন্তু I have seen Indian team or other team very Japanese it's quite but whatever you say is very firm. If I didn't have a corporation, I could have they're trained very smart. They are already up. They are auto they go, it is auto they go, they come to nitty-gritties. Things are not very easy to do. But if your intention is different, and you are aware, definitely and just have but one week. So I'm wish to call on that on just I'm revising the budget. Revised budget for where I'm not already thank you very much. It is a nice word. And thank you. And I look forward to this kind of thing. There's a kind of stage that not. Thank you. Very much from Dr. Ahmed and policy reasons.
Thank you. Thanks to Honourable Adviser. Let me just say, not the former thanks, but one of the very important things the Indian government has done is to not rescue an economy that was in a free fall. Free fall, the financial sector, our energy sector, number of areas. I'll give you one example of staggering numbers. The current year, Ministry of Finance and had to finance 60,000 crores, $5 billion of losses and liabilities just in the power and energy sector. did so with particular financing. Then I was reviewing the funding I issued for $6 billion. But this issue is with. One way I suggested me, what is you revoke that, what is the claim, and with claim to not be detectable. $6 billion issue taking further.
Right, because just in the power and energy sector, $5 billion of liability and losses that we deal with the past year. So, with that record, let me also, but on the there at a moment this time, if we look at transition to democracy, and let me just mention something, and I will give in the form of a joke in response to the good picture that in the first parliamentary democratic governments, 1991 to 1996, under the DFAT, right? We had a very dynamic finance minister, Ashikur Rahman, who did most of the things without pressure from the IMF. In fact, under him, there was no IMF program. The inherited one, but the first DFAT term took place, and under which a variety of reforms in the fiscal sector, financial sector, the privatization and bringing the economy towards the private sector and opening up the economy, all of that took place. The joke is, joke at that time in Dhaka was there was no need for the IMF or the World Bank to be in Bangladesh, because Ashikur Rahman was doing their work for them. So that was the joke, right? So I'm saying, so real reforms, in my experience around the world, are always done by leaders inside the country and democratic governments. And another thing I want to say as a matter of fact is most of the progress and achievement of Bangladesh has taken place under elected parliamentary governments. I think that's another point we have to keep in mind. And thankfully, we are returning to such a role. Hopefully, the tradition will continue. And as someone mentioned, the parties have expressed fairly high ambitions in terms of income growth, in terms of employment. I was very pleased to see the even mentioned that they have a target of FDI of 2.5% of GDP. No. That is so important, as my colleague from the World Bank was saying. Just to give you an example, in Vietnam, where exports went up from $70 billion to $400 billion in the last 15 years, 75% of that exports come from foreign direct investment. So that is beyond this trade sector, the investment sector and the investment climate where we can, in fact, foreign direct investment is extremely important, even in today's world. Because there is one question that the world trade is going down, but the world trade is still huge. World trade is $29 trillion. Garments alone is $550 billion. So our share of world trade is still a drop, and there is a lot of scope for us to go further. So with these points, let me once again say thank you to everyone for patiently listening to a very interesting discussion. And once again, thanks to our Honourable Chief Guest and all the panel participants. Thank you. One collective reflection in the back there.